Hello, and welcome to Lecture 33 for Ancient and Medieval Worlds, Mystics and Mongols. This lecture focuses really mostly on the 13th century, the 1200s, and has two main parts. Now, the first section is actually going to be in the first two parts of the video part 1 and video part 2, and that's going to act as a balance against the intellectual aspects of religion that we covered a couple of lectures ago with learning in the Middle Ages. And so here we're going to look at the mystical traditions which flourished in the 1200s and later, and sought really to approach God in a more emotional and instinctive kind of spirituality than the philosophical and often legalistic approaches of the schools that we looked at earlier. This was in some ways more important to the popular religion of ordinary people than the kind of academic theology that we saw earlier, and it gives us a chance to examine as well the conversion of Anatolia into what we now call Turkey when we particularly look at mysticism in the Islamic world, and that's going to be important to our course moving forward. That subject is going to segue well into the second theme of today's lecture in part 3 of the videos, the arrival of the Mongols in the 1200s into the parts of the world that we have been examining, and the devastating consequences this had in the short term, particularly for Islamic civilization. But it's going to be setting up the long-term economic growth and global connections that the Mongols facilitated that will have a great deal of impact in our next lecture and in subsequent lectures after that. So what is mysticism? Well, it's a difficult concept to explain clearly because at heart, mysticism is about seeking to experience the indescribable. It's about an attempt to approach God in simplest possible terms. That's what it is. Mysticism is the exercise of attempting to experience the divine directly. Now, mystical traditions are extremely ancient. I don't mean to suggest here that they began in the Middle Ages. There were certainly mystical elements of Greek polytheism, for instance, such as the so-called mystery cults of Eleusis or Orpheus. The prophetic books of the Hebrew Bible, like Isaiah and Ezekiel, contain passages that are often described as mystical visions of God. Promises of special secret knowledge to access the divine can be found in the Gnostic heresies of Christianity, traceable to the era of the composition of the New Testament. So mystical traditions can be found deep in the past of this period, and of course they can also be found all over the world, like Taoism or Zen Buddhism. Words often associated with mysticism include esoteric or ecstatic, and it is often viewed as being in opposition to the intellectual or rational approach to theology that we examined in our lecture on medieval learning, that was so influenced by Aristotelian logic and the scientific style of philosophy. Most modern scholars, however, now reject the idea that mystical and rational approaches to religion are inherently contradictory, and instead often seem to inspire each other and even can be found in the same individuals who practice both methods. So, for example, the famous Greek philosopher-scientist Pythagoras of triangle equation fame and also a great influence on Plato and Aristotle, believed that the math behind the astronomical movement of the planets was part of a celestial music, and that numbers held hidden secrets of the universe. In other words, it's hard to draw a firm line between intellectual approaches to religion like the theology we have looked at already and the mysticism that we will look at in these lectures today. And the same individuals could have mystical and rational aspects to their religious experience. That said, it seems entirely likely that the explosion of rational intellectual creativity that we saw in the 12th century Renaissance probably inspired a reaction that led to the profusion of mysticism in the 13th century that we're examining here. But I find it best to think of these movements as complementary rather than in opposition. One example of this that I would personally love to know more about is the Jewish mystical tradition known as Kabbalah, which began, or Kabbalah, I'm sorry, the pronunciation is not my strong suit here. And this began in the 12th century in the region that would later become Spain, and it exploded in popularity across European Jewish communities in the 13th century. The key text of the Kabbalah is the Zohar, a mystical commentary on the Torah which claims to have been written in the 2nd century during Roman times, but which first appeared in the 12th century 1,000 years later, and most scholars today agree that it's really a product of the 12th century that's trying to get a sense of authority and antiquity by claiming to be much older, although there may be much older elements in it. Some scholars believe that the popularity of the Zohar was inspired, at least in part, by the reaction against Maimonides' use of Aristotelian logic to comment upon the Talmud and Jewish religion in the previous generation. The Zohar is about the 10 emanations of God that are approachable by human beings, by which they may approach as closely as possible to the infinite part of God, which is beyond human experience entirely. If this sounds a little contradictory, that is also a deliberate feature of the Zohar, which is, like many mystical books, deliberately obscure and encourages contemplation of seeming contradictions in order to reach higher spiritual truth. This idea of emanations, of the infinite, is a common concept in mysticism that can even be found in later elements of Platonic philosophy in the ancient world, and it has influenced all the Abrahamic faiths. Mystics often borrow ideas from other mystics across the boundaries of faith, and in that respect, mysticism is a comparable intercultural experience to the excitement we saw over Aristotle's philosophy, that, as we also saw, led to a meeting of the minds between medieval Muslim, Jewish, and Christian philosophers who were all studying the works of an ancient Greek polytheist. Now, that's not to say that all mystics saw themselves as part of one great community that didn't care about religious differences. Many mystics asserted the superiority of their own faith over others, including many Jewish adherents of Kabbalah. That said, many later Christians became fascinated by the Zohar and Kabbalah. And in general, there were many mystics who believed that all faiths were trying to approach the same indescribable divinity. All that focus on overcoming contradictions creates an environment where such cross-cultural understandings become possible, if not necessary. Christianity also had a long history of mystical traditions before the 1200s, just like Judaism did, but here too there was an upsurge in mysticism in the 13th century, with new forms of mystical experience developing in Western Europe. And perhaps the most famous example of a mystic was St. Francis of Assisi, an Italian who founded a new religious order in 1209 called the Orders of Friars Minor. Literally the lesser brothers. The goal was to emphasize their humility. They're more commonly called Franciscans after him. These were similar to earlier monastic orders, and they are often confused with them. But they are technically a different type of ascetic from a monk. These friars are called mendicants, which was a word that literally means beggar. But that's because, unlike monks, Franciscans and other friars were supposed to go out into the world and preach to the people directly, relying on begging to survive rather than institutional wealth. Although, in the centuries since, they have indeed acquired institutional wealth, although they often attempted to reject it. Francis had quite the career and made an enormous impact in Europe. He even accompanied the Fifth Crusade and attempted to personally convert the Sultan of Egypt to Christianity. The Sultan at this point, a relative of Saladin's, seems to have been very polite, but ultimately ended up refusing this very strange man who came to him and said, "Why don't you convert to Christianity?" So you kind of have to imagine the Sultan of Egypt would have to be. But Francis's ultimate popularity stemmed from his ability to communicate his mystical experiences with God. Francis and his followers particularly emphasized a personal and in many ways physical connection with Jesus, part of an increasing movement in Europe to emotionally connect with the suffering of Jesus and his crucifixion. That's something that's very common in Christianity today, but in the earlier Middle Ages, this was not something that people had tended to focus on. Christ was not often emphasized as suffering on the cross. It did happen sometimes, but if you look at earlier depictions of Jesus before this period, he's usually not depicted as being on the cross, or even if he is, he doesn't seem to be suffering. Whereas increasingly from the period of Francis on, and I'm not saying Francis necessarily began this, but his Franciscan movement led to an increase in this, you begin to see images of Christ as suffering, something which can be emotionally identified with by the subject, by the viewer of the art. And that's something that was really emphasized by Francis and his movement. Francis himself famously is the first person to suffer from the stigmata, that is physically manifesting the wounds of the crucifixion in his own hands and feet, as we see depicted here in this famous work of art depicting Francis by Giotto, who we'll meet again in a later lecture on the Renaissance. Mysticism was not limited just to men. Indeed, most people who claimed to suffer the stigmata after Francis, this particularly physical form of mystical experience, were women mystics. And women mystics were religious celebrities in later medieval Europe. Female mystics like St. Catherine of Siena, who lived in the 14th century, became the counselors of kings and popes. Catherine is actually often credited with convincing the Pope to return to Rome after he and his immediate predecessors had spent the previous several decades living in France. Catherine's famous mystical experience revolved around a spiritual wedding with Jesus, which, although explicitly chaste and not sexual, was still expressed in intimately physical terms. Mysticism's inherently contradictory and overtly irrational nature gave many Christians, including women, an avenue to express themselves outside of traditional hierarchies and earn respect, admiration, and even power. In an environment that would normally have resisted allowing people from lower classes or people from who were not, well, for women who would otherwise have been shut out of the traditional hierarchy. Now, this was especially the case if they sought to avoid these things, as they often did with the humble Francis and Catherine. That said, Francis and Catherine in part were so successful because they worked with and were deferential towards the traditional church hierarchy, even though they both expressed a need for religious reform. But they did so within, or at least alongside, conventional channels to some degree. At the same time, many Franciscans and other mendicant friars became great intellectuals at the new universities of Europe. So again, mystical and rational approaches to religion coexisted with each other in the same individuals. Well, in this first part of the lecture, we've looked at the general ideas of mysticism, and we've seen some specific examples of the flowering of mysticism in the 13th century and later, particularly with Kabbalah in Jewish European mystical traditions, and with St. Francis and St. Catherine of Siena in Western European religious traditions, Christian religious traditions. In the next part of this lecture, we're going to look at Muslim mysticism with the Sufi orders, and we're also going to look at how this helped facilitate the conversion of Anatolia to Islam and what eventually led it to become what we now today know as Turkey.